Okay, so we are actually going to start discussing about the audit overview, because my approach of going through this audit is going to be that I am going to recall the overall audit, that how the audit is performed, what are the various stages of the audit, and then we would actually go on to the exam questions, because the best way to understand this AAA paper is to handle the exam question, that what are the various exam questions that are examined at the various stages of the audit. Now let's actually start off, and when we talk about the audit, so remember, where does the audit actually starts off from? When we talk about the starting point of the audit, so the audit actually starts off from the tendering stage. Now, what exactly do you mean by tendering for the audit? So let's try to understand that what do you mean by tender. So tender actually means that when you as a firm, you quote for an audit. When you quote for audit, so that is actually referred to as tendering for audit. So what do you mean by tendering for audit? Tendering for audit actually means you are quoting for an audit. Now, how does the tendering arises? So generally what happens is, usually the companies, they approach an auditor, and when they approach an auditor, they actually inquire the auditor, they ask the auditor that what exactly are they going to be charging, because usually what the company wants to do is that it wants to appoint an auditor. And when it wants to appoint an auditor, so what it does is it approaches the audit firm is asked to actually quote for it. So basically the first step for any specific audit is the tendering stage. Now, so if I am operating a firm, I need revenues, I need money. So should I actually tender for every single invitation that I am being given to tender? The answer is no. You should not actually quote for every specific tender that you are invited to tender. You should actually consider the various factors, and those various factors include the legal, they include ethical, they include commercial, and they include the professional matters. These are the things that need to be considered before quoting for an audit. So what are the factors that you would consider? You would have to consider legal, ethical, commercial, and professional matters. These are the four matters that you should consider before quoting for an audit. Now, what are the legal matters that you need to consider while quoting for the audit? So first of all is that there are usually various regulatory requirements as required by the stock exchange, as required by the Companies Act, which you need to follow if you have to act as an auditor for any specific company. So you need to consider whether your firm meets the legal requirement to be appointed as an auditor or not. So you need to consider whether your firm meets the legal requirement to be appointed as an auditor or not. That is the first step. So if you do meet the legal requirement, then you can quote for the audit. The second factor that you should consider is the ethical issues. So you have got the whole code of ethics, which actually lays down the fundamental ethical principle, which talks about the ethical threats to independence. So you need to consider all those factors, that are there any fundamental ethical issues that arises, or are there any ethical threats that actually arises by undertaking this specific audit or not. So for example, the CFO of the company is your childhood friend. So obviously a familiarity threat arises. And when the familiarity threat arises, you should not go for this audit. The third step is the commercial matters. Now, let's try to understand this thing. When the commercial considerations in any specific assignment are not up to the mark, then the quality of the audit goes down. And you cannot, as an auditor, compromise on the quality of the audit. So the important thing is that you should actually focus that if you are going to undertake this audit, then will this audit be meeting the commercial considerations or not? So if the audit is going to meet the commercial consideration, then you should tender for this audit. Otherwise, you should not tender for the audit. And lastly, the professional matters. Now, what are these professional matters that need to be considered? So I'm going to talk about them. Basically, what happens is, at times, the companies, what they do is that they appoint an audit firm because the previous auditor is overcharging. Or he may not be overcharging, but the company thinks that he is overcharging. So when we talk about the professional matters, so you need to consider that what are the reasons that this company wants to switch its auditor? What are the reasons that the company wants to change its auditor? So you need to consider these factors also before actually going for tendering an audit client. So when we talk about the tendering stage of the audit, so at the tendering stage of the audit, before you tender, you need to consider these 4 factors, which is legal, ethical, commercial, and the professional. So this is the first step where the audit actually starts off with. Now, so the first step of the audit is the tendering stage, and these are the factors that you need to consider. Now, once you have tendered for the audit and your tender has been accepted and you are being assigned an engagement, so what you need to do is that in accordance with ACCA 210, you should get an engagement letter signed. Now, the format for the engagement letter is actually provided under ACCA 210. And why is it important to have an engagement letter signed? The reason behind that is whenever we quote for an audit, so our initial tender, our initial quotation may be different, but ultimately the negotiations take place. And after the negotiation, the end result could be different. So it's important that you get an engagement letter signed. An engagement letter is a contract between the auditor and the client. And this engagement letter would cover up various things, which would include the scope of work, which would include the type of opinion, which would include the timings, which would include the fee and the other matters. So these are the various factors that are agreed and are quoted and are actually mentioned in the engagement letter. So when we talk about the engagement letter, these are the various factors that you actually need to consider. So once your tender is accepted, once you are being appointed as an auditor, you should get the engagement letter signed. And the engagement letter should cover up all these factors which are laid down in ACCA 210 and other factors which the auditor thinks are important to be agreed upon or to be discussed or to be signed off in the document. That's what should happen. Now let's move forward. So once you have tendered, once the tender has been accepted, the engagement letter has been signed, the next stage is the planning stage of the audit. When I talk about the planning stage of the audit, so what exactly do I mean by planning stage of the audit? Remember, the planning starts when you're appointed as an auditor. The planning starts when you're appointed as an auditor. So what exactly the planning involves? So the entire ACCA 300 series is about the planning stage of the audit. The entire ACCA 300 series is about the planning stage of the audit. Now, so the planning would involve understanding of entity. The planning would involve understanding of the environment. The planning would involve the assessment of the risk of material misstatement. The planning would involve staffing for the client. The planning would involve the overall audit strategy. These are all things which are covered at the planning stage. So what are the things that are covered at the planning stage? It's about staffing requirements of the client. It's about planning out the whole direction of the audit. It's about devising an audit strategy. It's about understanding of the entity, its environment, and assessing the risk of material misstatement. These are the various things that you consider at the planning stage of the audit. Now, I'll go in a bit more detail about this planning stage of the audit, but just right now, I'm just covering that what happens with the plan. So the major output of the planning stage of the audit is you have an audit strategy, you have an overall direction of the audit decided, and you have identified the risk involved in this specific audit. So once the planning stage is done, the next stage is the performance stage. Now what is this performance stage? The performance stage is where the actual audit is performed. So ACCA 500, ACCA 600, that's where the entire ACCA 500 and the ACCA 600 series applies. And the entire objective of this performance stage is basically to gather sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. is to gather sufficient and appropriate audit. So what happens is, once you have identified the risk at the planning stage, you move on to the next stage, and that is the performance stage of the audit. And when we move on to the performance stage of the audit, so what we do is that we perform the audit procedures. And the objective of performing the audit procedures is to gather sufficient and appropriate audit evidence such that you as an auditor can express an opinion. Such that you as an auditor can express an opinion. So once the planning is done, the next stage is the performance stage, where you try to gather sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. Okay, once the performance stage of the audit is done, then what happens is, either a senior manager or a partner, or maybe depending upon the hierarchical structure of the firm, would usually review the working papers. And when he would review the working papers of the audit, so what he would do is that he would say that after reviewing the working paper, he would see whether sufficient and appropriate audit evidence has been gathered or not. If sufficient and appropriate audit evidence has been gathered, so then he would actually go for conclusion of the audit by issuing the audit report. But if sufficient and appropriate audit evidence has not been gathered, then he would actually ask the team to perform additional audit procedures. And perform the additional audit procedure and gather sufficient and appropriate audit evidence and come back again so that he can conclude the audit. So what happens at the review and the reporting stage is that the senior manager or the partner, he reviews the working paper, he assesses whether sufficient and appropriate audit evidence has been gathered or not. If he is satisfied that yes, sufficient and appropriate audit evidence has been gathered, then he goes for the conclusion of the audit, which is issuing the audit report. And if he is not satisfied, then what he does is that he instructs his team to go back, perform additional audit procedure, and try to gather sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. That's what he does. So when we talk about the entire audit, so this is what the various stages of the audit involves. Now what does it involve? The various stages of the audit would involve, the first step is you tender. Once you tender and your tender has been accepted and you have been appointed, so you get the engagement letter signed. Once the engagement letter is signed, then what happens is you start planning for the audit. And the planning of the audit involves a lot of factors, a lot of things. Once you have planned for the audit, the next step is the performance stage of the audit. And what exactly do you mean by the performance stage of the audit? That is where the actual audit is performed. That is where the actual evidence is gathered. That is where the audit procedures are performed, the audit evidence is gathered. And once the audit evidence is being gathered, the senior manager or the partner, they review the evidence, they review the working paper. If they think sufficient and appropriate audit evidence has been gathered, so they go for the conclusion of the audit. And if they think no, it has not been gathered, then they instruct the team to perform additional audit procedure, gather more and more evidence, and then they would actually go for the conclusion of the audit. So this is how the various stages of the audit involved. So we have actually reviewed how the overall audit is performed.